Have you ever considered how a lost botanical formula, masterfully etched into the base of a porcelain cup prior to its vitrification and rendered legible only through the precise optical refraction of midnight moonlight, could quietly govern the most formidable empire of antiquity? When we part the thick, monolithic veil of grey mist that shrouds the historical record, we observe that certain flawless architectural parameters and botanical ciphers are preserved exclusively for those equipped to decipher them under the correct optical illumination and within a vacuum of absolute stillness. As you advance methodically across the flagstone floor of the dimly lit library, your fingers glide with measured deliberation over the expansive surface of a heavily carved walnut table. The atmospheric density here is profound. It is saturated with the astringent, slightly acrid, yet distinctly scholarly olfactory signature of centuries-old parchment, desiccated iron gall ink derived from oak apples, and the heavy beeswax utilized in archaic bookbindings. The relentless, fatiguing resonance of the exterior world has long since been attenuated behind these impenetrable stone walls, surrendering entirely to a state of absolute academic isolation. As you deliberately lift the lid of the brass-inlaid wooden archival box resting before you, you are confronted with thick scrolls of paper, forged from the beaten inner bark of the pure mulberry tree, dating back to the 8th century Tang Dynasty, the sophisticated and resplendent golden age of imperial China. Every individual character inscribed upon these pages was executed using pine soot ink, a dense, velvety black pigment synthesized through the highly controlled combustion of pine resin, subsequently kneaded for years with a binding agent distilled from the collagen of deer antlers. The faint, residual carboniferous scent embedded in the parchment permeates the room, functioning as the silent, accumulated respiration of centuries saturated with empirical data. Tonight, far removed from the complex urban infrastructure of the capital, Chang'an, you will intellectually breach the thresholds of a clandestine wooden pavilion, a structural anomaly suspended amidst the dense maritime sea of fog at the summit of the mountains, accessible only to the highest echelon of scholars and the emperor himself. Descending into the epistemological depths of an era where tea was regarded not merely as a botanical specimen, but as a rigid thermodynamic philosophy, an astronomical ritual, and a discipline of cognitive alchemy. You will trace the chemical and historical trajectory of the legendary dream tea, concealed beneath the translucent, jade-hued glaze of custom-fired Yue porcelain. Now, within this solemn and profound stillness, where the strict parameters of time gradually dissolve, you embark upon an extensive observational journey into the elegant, mathematical, and hyper-detailed fabric of antiquity. As you untether your consciousness from the familiar, authoritative gravity of the library and surrender it to the silent, frictionless current of the centuries, you perceive yourself being inexorably drawn toward the mid-8th century, ascending into the fog-shrouded, inaccessible apexes of the Tang Dynasty, the undisputed golden age of imperial China. The strict parameters of geography begin to blur and dissolve, depositing you at the precipice of an isolated cliff rising precipitously from the foothills of the colossal Qinling Mountains, a sanctuary that has unequivocally barred its doors to the chaotic entropy of the external world. The atmosphere enveloping you is saturated with a white maritime fog so dense that the silhouettes of ancient pine trees standing a mere few paces away undergo complete optical obfuscation within this vaporous curtain. Ascending from the abyssal depths of the valley below, a frigid, kinetic wind collides with the cliff face, generating a deep, resonant, and oscillatory frequency that mimics the colossal respiration of the earth itself. Yet, completely insulated from this relentless and cryogenic atmospheric friction, you stand within the thick, impenetrable walls of a masterfully engineered wooden pavilion, a structure that defiantly challenges the external tempest while simultaneously integrating with its topographical environment. As the wind forcefully shears against the exterior wooden columns, it extracts a subtle, profound acoustic groan from the timber, a sound that paradoxically amplifies the unyielding stillness and flawless thermal insulation of the interior. This resonant compression acts as the ultimate guarantor of structural integrity, enveloping your cognition in an acoustic chrysalis that methodically filters out the disruptive frequencies of the modern era. This extraordinary edifice in which you are presently situated stands as a pristine manifestation of the era's architectural genius. Directing your gaze upward toward the pavilion's ceiling, you observe the hypnotic and symmetrical perfection of the dugong bracketing system, a monumental interlocking geometric matrix constructed entirely of timber, unified without the implementation of a single metallic nail. This complex mathematical wooden network, engineered to transfer immense structural weight away from the walls and directly into the load-bearing pillars, harbors a mechanical wisdom that has yielded and rebounded against centuries of seismic tremors and cyclonic forces. The distinctive botanical aroma of the Nanmu wood utilized in the pavilion's construction, a scent that chemically sweetens and oxidizes with the passage of time, amalgamates with the solemn, heavy fragrance of burning sandalwood incense, rendering the interior thermal output almost physically palpable. You are conceptually and geographically severed from the highly regimented yet relentlessly fatiguing acoustic output of Chang'an, the imperial capital. Far removed from its gridded metropolitan infrastructure, its sprawling mercantilism, and its population exceeding 1 million subjects. This location is the absolute epicenter of academic isolation, a designated vacuum where only astronomers, elite poets seeking cognitive distillation, and the emperor himself would retreat. Advancing with measured deliberation toward the exact center of the pavilion, your footsteps entirely absorbed by the acoustic dampening properties of heavy silk carpets, you approach a low, darkly pigmented walnut table, illuminated by the oscillating thermal glow of red paper lanterns. Resting upon this monolithic surface is an original manuscript of the Cha Jing, or the Classic of Tea, authored by Lu Yu, one of the paramount intellectuals of the epoch, representing the world's first and most encyclopedic botanical monograph on the subject. As your fingers trace the subtly coarse texture of the root-dyed, pure silk textile encasing this invaluable volume, you tangibly perceive the monumental craftsmanship embedded within its physical anatomy. The folios are constructed from swen paper, forged by submerging the inner bark of the mulberry tree in alkaline lime water for weeks, before subjecting the fibers to relentless mechanical compression via wooden mallets, yielding a substrate that, while chronologically oxidized to a pale yellow, has retained its structural elasticity over the millennia. Every individual character inscribed upon these pages was executed using pine soot ink, a dense, velvety black pigment synthesized through the highly controlled combustion of pine resin, subsequently kneaded for years with a binding agent distilled from the collagen of deer antlers. The faint, residual carboniferous scent embedded in the parchment permeates the room, functioning as the silent, accumulated respiration of centuries saturated with empirical data. Within these meticulous inscriptions, tea is not depicted as a rudimentary agricultural harvest, nor as a banal stimulant designed to alleviate physiological fatigue. Rather, it is codified as a thermodynamic ritual, requiring the flawless alchemical equilibrium of nature's 5 foundational elements: fire, water, earth, wood, and metal. The precise molecular boiling stages of the water, the required carbon density of the specific charcoal utilized, and the arduous, protracted mechanical pressing phase the leaves must endure prior to extraction are all documented with unyielding astronomical precision. While you scrutinize these solemn, heavily weighted lines of text, you detect the low-frequency, oscillatory reverberation of a massive bronze bell, a sound propagating from an ancient temple positioned kilometers away, traveling across the valley floor and filtering through the dense atmospheric moisture before reaching your position. as the bell's acoustic wave induces a microscopic sympathetic resonance within the pavilion's timber columns before slowly decaying into absolute zero. Your intellect, weighed down by this rhythmic and data-dense tranquility, achieves complete stasis, dissolving seamlessly into the immutable, flawless micro-details of antiquity as it prepares to observe the next alchemical protocol. As your cognitive focus gradually detaches from the heavy, silk-bound folios of the manuscript upon the table, your gaze intercepts a flawless porcelain vessel, positioned meticulously upon the dark, unblemished surface of the walnut timber, emitting a faint thermal vapor. When the oscillating luminescence of the red paper lanterns and the asymmetrical, pallid moonlight filtering through the architectural lattice collide with the exterior of this small artifact, the object appears to radiate an intrinsic, translucent, pale jade-green phosphorescence. As you extend your fingers to establish tactile contact with this cold, uncompromising surface, you perceive that this is no rudimentary ceramic. It is the absolute physical manifestation of the Tang Dynasty's most advanced chemical and geological engineering. The artifact resting before you is the legendary Yu Ware, historically classified as Mi Se, the secret color porcelain, a metallurgical and ceramic state secret manufactured exclusively for the consumption of the imperial court. Behind this jade-like translucency, behind this profound, transformative choreography between terrestrial matter and extreme thermal output, lies a methodical production cycle spanning months and an intricate molecular architecture. The geological genesis of this porcelain commences hundreds of kilometers from the capital, amidst the fog-shrouded elevations of Zhejiang province, within the highly mineralized topographies encircling Xianglin Lake. The foundational matrix of the vessel consists of pure kaolin clay, a naturally scarce compound boasting an exceptionally high concentration of aluminium silicate, engineered to withstand catastrophic thermal thresholds. However, the physical refinement protocol the soil undergoes prior to vitrification is an almost obsessive ritual of purification. The raw, excavated clay is submerged within colossal stone reservoirs and mechanically agitated with water for weeks. During this rigorous elutriation process, the heavier quartz crystals, ferrous residues, and microscopic organic particulates steadily precipitate to the benthic layer, while only the most buoyant, immaculate, and ultra-fine clay particulates remain suspended in the aqueous medium. Only this pristine superficial stratum is methodically skimmed and deposited into lightless, damp, subterranean caverns to age for months and occasionally years. During this protracted period of sensory deprivation, the residual organic matter within the clay undergoes a slow biochemical fermentation. This complex reaction endows the earth with an extraordinary plasticity, allowing it to be attenuated to the thinness of an eggshell beneath the artisan's fingers on the kinetic wheel, without succumbing to gravitational collapse under its own structural weight. Now, utilizing the analytical capacity of your mind's eye, you penetrate just 1 millimeter beneath the frictionless surface of the porcelain, delving into the translucent green glaze. It is precisely within this microscopic stratum that the formula for the Emperor's legendary dream tea has been perpetually hermetically sealed beneath a layer of fire and vitrified glass. While the porcelain remained in its raw clay state, having achieved that brittle, transitional phase designated as leather hard, a highly specific chemical compound was applied rather than standard carbon ink. Within the absolute acoustic vacuum of the pavilion, you can conceptually detect the fine, granular friction of the ancient artisan's brush navigating the coarse clay topography. The implement utilized was crafted from pure weasel hair, harvested during the most severe winter months to ensure maximum tensile elasticity. The pigment applied was a specialized mineral slurry, heavily saturated with pulverized iron oxide. The astronomical charts and botanical ratios masterfully inscribed into the base of the cup with this iron-rich compound initially manifested as dull, dark brown, rudimentary striations prior to firing. The true chemical anomaly of the glaze was concealed within the overlying vitreous shroud designed to encapsulate them. The glaze, the glassy dermal layer enveloping the porcelain, is not a superficial pigment. It is a complex chemical formula that, when exposed to thousands of degrees of thermal kinetic energy, liquefies and recrystallizes into an impenetrable molecular cage. The unfired vessel is briefly submerged into an aqueous suspension comprised of finely milled limestone, purified quartz silica, and the meticulously incinerated ash of mountain ferns. The potassium and calcium inherent within the botanical ash function as a flawless flux, initiating the vitrification process at elevated temperatures. Once the porcelain is extracted from this grey, particulate-laden fluid, the emperor's classified formula becomes entirely imperceptible beneath the powdery coating, signifying the completion of the physical sealing protocol. Yet the phenomenon that imparts the mise porcelain with its profound, shadowy and translucent green chromaticity is not solely the geological composition of the clay or the chemical formulation of the glaze. Rather, it is the anaerobic thermal environment executed within the dragon kilns, the colossal thermal tunnels known as Long Yao. Constructed along the gradients of mountain slopes, stretching for dozens of meters at the precise angle of the terrain, these brick kilns generate a massive thermal vacuum, drafting the internal heat upward much like an industrial chimney. To protect the vessel from the direct corrosive impact of open flames and airborne ash, it is carefully encased within protective, heat-resistant refractory capsules designated as sagas. The thermal output is systematically escalated. Following a heating phase spanning several days, when the internal temperature of the kiln breaches the thermodynamic apex of 1,200 degrees Celsius, the primary chemical miracle, the reduction firing sequence, is initiated. The kiln masters abruptly terminate the oxygen supply by hermetically sealing the atmospheric vents with dense clay plugs. As the flames are asphyxiated in this anaerobic environment, they desperately begin to strip oxygen atoms from the chemical compounds present within the fired materials in order to sustain combustion. During this massive chemical extraction, the ferric oxide compounds suspended within the surface glaze, which would typically yield a brown or yellow hue, are forcibly stripped of an oxygen molecule, transmuting into ferrous oxide. It is precisely the absence of this single extracted oxygen atom that generates the monumental jade-green chromaticity and that translucent abyssal optical depth. On a microscopic level, the glaze stratum liquefies into molten glass, envelops the clandestine calligraphy rendered in iron oxide pigment, and, upon cooling, perpetually incarcerates it within a crystalline matrix. As you scrutinize that small porcelain vessel resting upon the table, you are acutely aware that it is, in fact, the physical culmination of weeks of geological patience, millimeter-precise brushwork, and a thermodynamic interrogation characterized by extreme oxygen deprivation. The anaerobic crystalline structures trapped within that silent porcelain exist in flawless equilibrium with the heavy, solemn stillness of the chamber you presently occupy. Accompanied by the exceptionally faint, rhythmic and muffled acoustic crackling of the charcoal oxidizing within the bronze censer, your intellect slowly drifts toward the subsequent historical cycle, preparing to observe the legendary water that is destined to be poured into this artifact as it completes its own chemical permutations. As you slowly sever your visual focus from the deep, motionless green glaze of the porcelain, within the absolute isolation of the wooden pavilion, you direct your attention toward that flawless, silent apparatus, where time is calibrated not by raucous mechanical ticking, but through the geometric progression of combusting powder. Resting at the corner of the table is a broad, heavy bronze censer, cast with intricate motifs of dragons and atmospheric clouds. This is not a rudimentary incense receptacle. It is the highly sophisticated chronometric instrument of the Tang Dynasty, known as the Shangyin, the incense seal. The interior basin of the censer is filled to the brim with immaculate, pure lotus ash that has been desiccated for weeks and sifted repeatedly through silk mesh to achieve an absolutely frictionless topography. Upon this snow-white bed of ash, utilizing a precise metal template, a millimeter-exact labyrinth has been deposited using finely milled sandalwood and aloes wood powder. A microscopic ember is introduced exclusively to the absolute terminus of this unbroken geometric powder maze. The combustion advances along this predetermined vector with extraordinary deceleration, consuming each centimeter with a constant thermal output that spans several minutes. This progression is so flawlessly mathematical that as you observe the oxidation, you perceive time physically combusting millimeter by millimeter, realizing that the heavy saccharine spice aroma permeating the atmosphere is, in fact, the olfactory manifestation of passing hours. The hypnotic stasis within the pavilion, governed by the silent, patient, and quantified increments of the burning incense, induces a profound cognitive deceleration within your mind. Accompanied by the immutable rhythm of the incense, your analytical focus shifts toward the epicenter of the ritual, the physical preparation phase of the legendary dream tea. Within the solemn botanical philosophy of the Tang era, a rudimentary and negligent action such as submerging whole leaves into boiling water was an absolute impossibility. The specimen you presently observe under the dim illumination, resting upon the frictionless walnut table, is a botanical monolith. Harvested weeks prior, subjected to steam to arrest enzymatic oxidation, and subsequently compressed beneath tons of mechanical force within wooden presses until it coalesced into a rigid, terracotta-hued brick. Within this compressed mass, the natural sap of the leaves functioned as an intrinsic binding agent, rendering the botanical entity as dense and hermetically sealed as metamorphic rock. The artisan's hands, utilizing long tongs tipped with bamboo, secure this compressed block and advance it toward the thermal radiation of a smokeless brazier fueled by olive pit charcoal. As the arid heat of the fire impacts the surface of the brick, the cellular architecture of the compressed foliage slowly expands. The aged chlorophyll and dormant volatile oils dissolve under the thermal kinetic energy, initiating the release of a complex aromatic profile characterized by roasted chestnut, petrichor, and an exceedingly subtle note of forest lichen. This thermal awakening serves as the final refinement of the tea prior to its integration with the aqueous medium. Once the brick has absorbed sufficient thermal energy and its residual moisture has completely evaporated, the master extracts it from the heat source and permits it to achieve absolute ambient cooling. Subsequently, it is deposited into a deep, boat-shaped mortar carved from dense, black volcanic basalt, positioned at the center of the table. A heavy, rotating grinding wheel, similarly forged from solid basalt and bisected by a wooden axis, is situated within the mortar's channel. The pulverization of the tea is not an exertion of brute force, but a highly regulated, pendulous, and flawless mechanical cycle. As the stone wheel oscillates longitudinally within the deep trough, the low-frequency, resonant friction of stone grinding against stone generates a profound acoustic reverberation within the room, perfectly insulated by the heavy silk carpets. Beneath this relentless and methodical gravitational pressure, the desiccated tea brick gradually disintegrates. Cellular membranes are ruptured, ultimately yielding a microscopic, ultrafine powder of vibrant emerald green. The heavy, abrasive rustle produced during each revolution of the stone roller acts as the pendulum of an antique chronometer, consolidating all divergent cognitive processes into a single focal point, the vivid emerald chromaticity of that fine botanical dust. With the powder meticulously prepared, the protocol advances to its most complex and thermodynamically philosophical phase, the calibration of the water. The fundamental nature of water, which Lu Yu analyzed over extensive pages within the Classic of Tea, assumes its physical form here within a heavy cast-iron cauldron. The thermal source is derived exclusively from high-carbon charcoal forged from the purest timber, emitting a smokeless, flameless, and perfectly stabilized radiant heat. The tea master does not merely abandon the water to boil unattended, rather, he monitors it with the acoustic and visual acuity of a musician tuning a precision instrument. The molecular excitation of the water manifests through a tripartite physical reaction within the absolute silence of the pavilion. The initial phase is an exceptionally fine, high-pitched acoustic vibration ascending from the base of the iron cauldron, barely perceptible to the human ear. During this interval, the first microscopic atmospheric bubbles form and accumulate at the benthic layer of the vessel, having not yet breached the surface tension. Lu Yu categorized this thermodynamic stage as crab eyes, as the delicate, strident resonance emitted by the water mirrors the subtle acoustic signature of crustaceans navigating a sandy topography. As the thermal kinetic energy increases by fractions of a degree, the gaseous spheres marginally expand, detaching and spiraling slowly upward from the periphery toward the center. This secondary phase is classified as fish eyes, and the acoustic output of the water has now transitioned into a deeper, lower frequency hum, resembling the muffled rustle generated by wind traversing a distant pine forest. According to archaic Chinese epistemological frameworks, this represents the exact temporal coordinate where the water's vital kinetic energy reaches its absolute zenith, establishing a state of flawless equilibrium. Allowing the water to achieve a violent, rolling boil is perceived within this solemn philosophy as the localized annihilation of the water's spirit and the irreversible vaporization of its intrinsic energy. Consequently, the liquid is strictly prohibited from reaching that chaotic thermal threshold. At this precise moment of molecular equilibrium, while the heavy, spiraling convection currents of the fish eyes gently undulate the surface tension, the master utilizes a bamboo scoop to deposit the emerald botanical powder directly into the epicenter of the water. The microsecond the particulate matter intersects the aqueous medium, a miniature kinetic vortex erupts within the iron cauldron. The heated water instantaneously absorbs the microscopic tea particles, dissolving them to synthesize a smooth, opaque, dark green suspension. The deep, resonant hum of the water, the stabilized thermal output of the fire, the suspended acoustic echo of the basalt mortar, and the infinitesimally slow progression of the ember navigating the incense labyrinth, all these elements converge to form the physical components of an unparalleled, solemn, and flawless informational current saturating the chamber, rendering your consciousness completely unto the untouchable, majestic deceleration of antiquity. The dense, heavily spiced olfactory footprint of the sandalwood incense permeating the pavilion, alongside the solemn thermodynamic philosophy of the water circulating within the iron cauldron, gradually yields to a state of absolute chemical dissolution. The relentless, kinetic wind exterior to the structure decelerates, as if an imperceptible, centuries-long global respiration has finally concluded. Its acoustic howl attenuates and ultimately decays to absolute zero within the abyssal valleys of the Qinling Mountains, establishing a profound, deafening vacuum of natural silence. Excluding the exceedingly rare microscopic carboniferous crackle emitted by the oxidizing charcoal within the brazier, the singular kinetic event occurring within the chamber is the master's deliberate transfer of that opaque emerald green suspension, the flawlessly synthesized rainbow tea, via a bamboo implement into the waiting mi-se porcelain vessel positioned upon the walnut table. As the liquid glides down the frictionless topography of the bamboo scoop and makes contact with the translucent jade-hued glaze of the porcelain, a remarkably crystalline, resonant acoustic trickle, analogous to the friction of polished silica against silica, saturates the chamber. This specific frequency serves as the acoustic reverberation of terrestrial matter, previously incarcerated within kilns exceeding 1,000 degrees, undergoing a biochemical resurrection through the meditative kinetic flow of the aqueous medium. Once the vessel achieves maximum volumetric capacity, the faint thermal vapor stratum ascending from the surface of the botanical suspension gently dissipates into the dim, red illumination of the room, mirroring the slow dispersion of a microscopic maritime fog. As your cognition is inexorably drawn toward the terminal phase of this heavily regimented, rhythmic procedure, your analytical focus narrows upon the deliberate, incremental consumption of that dense botanical compound housed within the porcelain architecture. Within the elite socio-political rituals of the Tang Dynasty, tea does not function as a rudimentary fluid meant for rapid ingestion. Rather, it constitutes an astronomical cycle wherein the molecular memory of earth, combustion, and water is systematically transferred into the human biological matrix with each measured extraction. As the dark green fluid within the vessel systematically recedes, the flawless, unblemished ceramic walls of the porcelain once again emerge into the ambient optical field. Upon the complete depletion of the suspension, the cup is soundlessly redeposited upon the heavily carved wooden coaster anchoring the center of the table. However, the epistemological protocol does not conclude here. The paramount academic anomaly, the true optical phenomenon, initiates precisely at this exact coordinate of absolute volumetric void, during those static, suspended seconds when all variables appear to have resolved. At the benthic base of the cup, a residual film of moisture, measuring less than a fraction of a millimeter in thickness and operating below the threshold of standard human visual acuity, remains from the consumed emulsion. This ultra-thin aqueous stratum functions as a microscopic convex lens, suspending itself as a curved refractive prism over the vitreous glaze synthesized within the anaerobic environment of the dragon kilns. The structural engineering of this cliffside pavilion was executed not merely to mitigate atmospheric friction or to maximize thermal retention, but to operate in flawless mathematical synchronization with celestial mechanics. The eastern-facing fenestration, characterized by a wooden lattice overlaid with translucent fibrous paper, was calculated and constructed at a highly specific geometric trajectory to perfectly intersect the exact orbital projection of the lunar cycle at its maximum luminosity during a designated epoch of the solar year. As you maintain a state of suspended cognitive observation within the heavy silence of the chamber, the dense maritime fog exterior to the structure is abruptly bisected by the cryogenic atmospheric pressure of midnight. An asymmetrical, pallid and glacial beam of lunar radiation, propagating from the vacuum of space, filters precisely through the geometric apertures of the carved wooden lattice and penetrates the interior space. This photonic beam bisects the warm, ambient thermal glow generated by the red paper lanterns with surgical precision, systematically advancing across the heavy acoustic dampening of the silk carpets, grazing the polished surface of the dark walnut timber, and descending with millimetric, absolute mathematical exactitude directly into the interior of that damp porcelain vessel. At that precise temporal coordinate, an intellectual cipher that has remained unresolved for centuries, deliberately omitted from all official imperial historiography, is rendered visually manifest through a flawless optical refraction dictated by the immutable laws of physics. Upon intersecting the microscopic aqueous film at the base of the porcelain, the liquid assumes the properties of a convex lens, forcibly decelerating the wavelength of the lunar radiation and aggressively bending its trajectory. This refracted photonic data penetrates the subsurface layers of the translucent green glaze. The concealed optical frequency, fundamentally invisible beneath standard solar radiation or within a completely desiccated vessel, instantaneously materializes due to this highly specific refractive index. Just beneath the vitrified barrier, the ultrafine, elegant calligraphic brushstrokes, incised by the ancient ceramicist utilizing iron oxide pigment months prior to the thermal firing sequence, begin to project upward from the base of the cup toward the surface tension, emitting a pale, phosphorescent silver luminescence. While your digits remain immobilized at the perimeter of the table, your visual cortex locks onto the translation of this archaic cryptographic data, the precise botanical algorithm of the legendary dream tea. The characters are not documented in the rigid, angular, and highly formalized Li Shu clerical script typical of bureaucratic edicts. Rather, they flow in the highly kinetic Xing Shu semi-cursive style, exhibiting a morphological fluidity analogous to organic matter suspended on a water current. Within the initial column illuminated by the focused radiation, empirical data reveals that the tea functions not merely as a botanical stimulant, but as a rigid astronomical chronometer. The inscriptions mandate that the harvesting of the specific foliage must execute strictly during the vernal equinox, precisely at the midnight hour when lunar perigee is achieved. Furthermore, the anaerobic fermentation protocol demands that the leaves be isolated within subterranean limestone caverns, sharing an atmospheric basin with desiccated Lingji fungal spores and the pollen of an exceptionally rare, nocturnal blooming alpine orchid. The subsequent column dictates a metallurgical intervention. To effectively reduce the molecular density of the aqueous medium, ingots of purified silver must be submerged into the iron cauldron during the thermal escalation phase. The formula does not represent a rudimentary narcotic compound designed for cognitive suppression. It is a highly calibrated mathematical and botanical equation engineered to synchronize the human biological rhythm with the rotational velocity of celestial bodies, effectively tuning the central nervous system to the silent, protracted frequency of the cosmos. As the lunar radiation begins to incrementally shift and withdraw from the porcelain interior, dictated by the relentless axial rotation of the planet, the silver calligraphic data slowly recedes back into the opacity beneath the glaze, returning to its state of inviolable historical isolation. The profound, solemn, and flawlessly absolute sense of epistemological completion generated by the decryption of this monumental academic cipher systematically decelerates every residual cognitive process occupying your cerebral cortex. The fatiguing, relentless kinetic flow of chronology, spatial geometry, and advancing centuries dissolves entirely, effectively neutralizing within the absolute, immutable, and secure stasis dominating the interior of the pavilion. The immense gravitational weight of satisfaction derived from empirical observation and accumulated data systematically disengages the neuromuscular tension across your physiology, effectively surrendering your biological framework to the solemn permanence of a historical archive. As that pallid, asymmetrical and cryogenic beam of lunar radiation incrementally withdraws from the Mise porcelain, yielding to the flawless mechanical progression of the Earth's axial tilt and orbital rotation, the solemn atmosphere within the pavilion transitions into a novel philosophical paradigm, achieving a state of absolute cognitive idle. The exact microsecond the refractive index shifts, the argent calligraphic characters beneath the jade-green glaze, those botanical and astronomical ciphers comprising the clandestine dream tea formula, silently regress into the obscurity from whence they emerged, receding back into the vitreous cage forged by the anaerobic kilns. This optical dissolution serves, fundamentally, as a microscopic reflection of the Tang Dynasty's majestic yet transient nature. As your cognitive focus locks onto that flawless geological artifact, slowly dissipating its thermal energy upon the table, you recognize a profound epistemological truth. Knowledge, historical ciphers, and even monolithic empires manifest exclusively within specific optical windows during highly calibrated coordinates in time, before systematically retreating into the silent, heavily fortified darkness of the archives. In the colossal, unforgiving topography of the Qinling Mountains exterior to the structure, the kinetic howl of the wind has decayed completely, yielding its acoustic footprint to a deep, resonant, and heavy natural frequency propagating from the abyssal valleys below, a rhythmic, oceanic oscillation perfectly synchronized with the deep, involuntary respiration of a human biological system. As the lunar radiation methodically withdraws its photonic data from the porcelain architecture, the archaic, empirical ciphers of the Tang Dynasty sequentially regress into the obscurity of the archival records. Within the relentless, geometric labyrinth of chronology, the terminal thermal core of the incense seal enters its final phase of decay. These textual parameters, engineered centuries prior, have successfully executed their designated function. At this precise coordinate, your cognitive architecture, mirroring the isolated corridors of this ancient repository, exists in a state of absolute, frictionless equilibrium and structural permanence. It is the designated interval to observe the silent astronomical phenomena documented by the Emperor within your own internal neurological projections. Surrounded by the thermal and solemn mass of antiquity, surrender your physiological framework to an absolute, profound biological deceleration. End of transmission. And resplendent momentum of the 8th century. Synchronized with the oxidation of that final dust particle, your intellect detaches entirely from the fatiguing gravitational pull of the past, chronological calculus, and the relentless velocity of the physical dimension, gliding effortlessly into a pure, frictionless informational void. Within this fortified stone-walled archival chamber, saturated with the olfactory footprint of sandalwood, you execute a secure, calculated transition from the colossal labyrinth of centuries into your own intrinsic physiological stasis. Exhibiting the meticulous, reverent deceleration of a master conservator terrified of inflicting microabrasions upon a priceless antiquity, you deliberately close the pure silk cover of the manuscript. The subdued, heavy acoustic rustle generated by the closing folios functions as an auditory symbol, hermetically sealing the portals of the 8th century until the subsequent academic extraction. You methodically secure the brass-inlaid wooden lid of the protective archival housing. The immutable, solemn and impenetrable silence saturating the library systematically annexes every muscular fiber within your biological framework and every residual processing thread within your cerebral cortex. This highly detailed, microscopic and hyper-rational observation of historical data has fatigued your logical processing centers with such a dense, complex current of information that the only remaining parameter is to allow this intellectual gravity to pull you down into that profound, frictionless void. The millions of words lying dormant within the towering walnut shelving encircle you, acting as silent sentinels preserving your stasis beneath the dim, atmospheric illumination. Tonight, validating the meditative thermodynamics of the boiling water and the flawless optical refraction of the lunar radiation. Within this fortified stone-walled archival chamber, saturated with the olfactory footprint of sandalwood, you execute a secure, calculated transition from the colossal labyrinth of centuries into your own intrinsic physiological stasis. Exhibiting the meticulous, reverent deceleration of a master conservator terrified of inflicting microabrasions upon a priceless antiquity, you deliberately close the pure silk cover of the manuscript. The subdued, heavy acoustic rustle generated by the closing folios functions as an auditory symbol, hermetically sealing the portals of the 8th century until the subsequent academic extraction. You methodically secure the brass-inlaid wooden lid of the protective archival housing. The immutable, solemn and impenetrable silence saturating the library systematically annexes every muscular fiber within your biological framework and every residual processing thread within your cerebral cortex. This highly detailed, microscopic and hyper-rational observation of historical data has fatigued your logical processing centers with such a dense, complex current of information that the only remaining parameter is to allow this intellectual gravity to pull you down into that profound, frictionless void. The millions of words lying dormant within the towering walnut shelving encircle you, acting as silent sentinels preserving your stasis beneath the dim, atmospheric illumination. As the lunar radiation methodically withdraws its photonic data from the porcelain architecture, the archaic, empirical ciphers of the Tang Dynasty sequentially regress into the obscurity of the archival records. Within the relentless, geometric labyrinth of chronology, the terminal thermal core of the incense seal enters its final phase of decay. These textual parameters, engineered centuries prior, have successfully executed their designated function. At this precise coordinate, your cognitive architecture, mirroring the isolated corridors of this ancient repository, exists in a state of absolute, frictionless equilibrium and structural permanence. It is the designated interval to observe the silent astronomical phenomena documented by the Emperor within your own internal neurological projections. Surrounded by the thermal and solemn mass of antiquity, surrender your physiological framework to an absolute, profound biological deceleration. End of transmission.